I am Walter, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate developer in Cleveland, I spent my entire life building an empire from concrete and steel. I thought I had constructed a fortress of absolute security for my loved ones, but I was entirely wrong. Just last weekend, my family gathered to celebrate a lavish rehearsal dinner for my son, an event I paid $150,000 to host. Between the speeches and the laughter, my wife of 35 years leaned across the table, smiling at me with what I thought was pure affection. I simply sipped my drink and smiled back. Little did I know I was funding my own execution. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood taught me the value of $1 and the importance of loyalty. When I made my fortune, I swore my family would never know the struggles I faced. My son, Preston, and my wife, Marlene, lived a life of absolute privilege in our Shaker Heights mansion. I gave them everything they ever asked for, blindly trusting that blood and marriage meant unconditional love. 3 days after the wedding, that illusion shattered forever. I was sitting in my sunroom on a quiet Tuesday morning, sipping my coffee and enjoying the rare silence in the house. The chaos of the wedding weekend had finally passed, and I was looking forward to a peaceful retirement. Then, my private phone rang. I answered it, expecting a call from my broker. Instead, it was Marcus, the general manager of the exclusive restaurant where we held the rehearsal dinner. His voice was trembling, completely stripped of its usual professional polish. He told me they had just rechecked the security camera footage from our private dining room. He said I needed to see it myself immediately. He begged me to come alone, and warned me, whatever I do, not to tell my wife a single thing about his call. The drive from my home in the Shaker Heights to the downtown financial district usually takes a predictable 20 minutes. That morning, however, every second felt like a grueling eternity. My mind raced through endless scenarios, trying desperately to rationalize Marcus's panicked phone call. Did a guest steal something valuable? Did an argument break out that I somehow missed? But none of those theories explained why he explicitly instructed me to keep my wife in the dark. Marlene had been my trusted partner for nearly 4 decades. We had built our entire lives together. The mere suggestion of hiding something from her felt deeply unnatural and wrong. When I finally pulled up to the valet stand at the restaurant, the street was unusually quiet. The establishment was closed to the public, hours away from its lunch service. Marcus was waiting anxiously by the heavy glass doors. He did not greet me with his usual warm smile or confident handshake. His face was visibly pale, and he anxiously scanned the empty sidewalk before ushering me inside and quickly locking the front doors behind us. He did not say a single word as he led me through the cavernous, darkened dining room. We walked past the empty tables and the silent kitchen, finally arriving at a narrow hallway in the back. He opened the door to a small, windowless security office, packed with filing cabinets and glowing surveillance monitors. Marcus stepped inside, closed the heavy door, and engaged the deadbolt. The loud click of the lock echoed in the cramped space, making my heart beat a little faster. He wiped his sweating forehead with a tissue and apologized profusely for involving me. He explained that he did not know who else to contact, and he could not go to the police without showing me the evidence first, because it involved my immediate family. I told him to stop apologizing and just show me the tape. My voice sounded steady, masking the growing knot of dread forming in my stomach. He sat at the desk, typed a few commands into his keyboard, and brought the main monitor to life. It displayed a high-definition, full-color feed of the private dining room from Saturday night. I instantly recognized the vibrant scene. The tables were adorned with expensive white linens and massive floral centerpieces. My family was seated at the primary head table, laughing and enjoying the expensive wine I had purchased. There I was on the screen, sitting proudly at the center of the table. To my left sat Marlene, radiant in her evening gown. To my right sat my son Preston and his new wife, Vivian. Marcus whispered for me to watch closely, specifically paying attention to what happens the moment I leave the table. On the screen, I watched my phone light up. I clearly remembered taking a call from an old business associate, congratulating us on the wedding. I watched my digital self stand up, excuse myself from the dinner, and walk out of the camera's view to find a quiet place to speak. The very second my back disappeared from the frame, the entire atmosphere at the head table shifted in a way that made my blood run absolutely cold. The warm, celebratory smiles dropped instantly. Marcus pointed a trembling finger at the screen and told me to look at my wife. I stared at Marlene. Her face had hardened into a cold, calculating mask of pure malice. She quickly scanned the dining room, checking the positions of the serving staff and the surrounding guests. Once she was satisfied no one was watching, she turned her head slightly toward Vivian and gave a single, sharp nod. It was an unmistakable command. My breath caught in my throat. I felt completely paralyzed, rooted to the floor of the security room as the nightmare unfolded before my eyes. Upon receiving my wife's signal, my sweet, seemingly innocent daughter-in-law sprang into action. Vivienne, the girl who played the role of a demure, educated professional, calmly reached into her designer clutch. Her movements were smooth, practiced, and utterly terrifying. She pulled out a tiny, clear glass vial. I wanted to close my eyes, to scream at the monitor, but I was entirely captivated by the horror. I watched as Vivienne casually unscrewed the cap of the vial with one hand. She reached across the table, hovering her arm directly over my half-empty glass of expensive scotch. But what truly shattered my soul, what broke me into a million irreparable pieces, was the reaction of my own flesh and blood. Preston did not gasp in shock. He did not attempt to stop his wife. Instead, the exact moment Vivian reached over my drink, Preston actively shifted his heavy dining chair backward. He broadened his shoulders and leaned awkwardly to his left, deliberately creating a human shield to block the line of sight of a waiter who happened to be walking past the table. It was a perfectly synchronized, highly coordinated maneuver executed by three people working together with a singular, sinister purpose. My wife gave the lethal order. My daughter-in-law delivered the payload. My son provided the necessary cover. With a subtle flick of her wrist, Vivienne dropped a thick, clear liquid from the tiny vial straight into my drink. It dissolved instantly, vanishing into the amber alcohol without leaving a single trace. Vivienne quietly slipped the empty vial back into her purse. Preston casually shifted his chair back into its normal position. Marlene calmly picked up her wine glass. On the screen, the three of them looked at each other, sharing a silent, knowing look of victory. And then they smiled. They raised their crystal glasses and gently clinked them together, directly over my poisoned scotch. They were toasting to my murder, celebrating my impending death while spending my money. A few moments later, the footage showed me returning to the table, smiling like a gullible fool. I sat back down, completely oblivious to the venom sitting in my glass. I picked up the scotch, raised it toward my family in a loving toast, and drank the entire glass. Marcus pressed a button, freezing the frame on my smiling face as I swallowed the poison. The silence in the small office was suffocating. The only sound was the frantic, shallow gasping coming from my own lungs. My legs suddenly lost all their strength. I stumbled backward, blindly grabbing the edge of a filing cabinet to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. My world had just been completely obliterated. The people I loved the most, the family I shared my wealth, my home, and my legacy with, had just conspired to assassinate me in a crowded room. Marcus stepped forward cautiously, asking if I was all right and if he needed to call for medical help. I could not form the words to answer him. The betrayal was an intense, physical pain radiating deep within my chest. I placed a shaking hand over my heart. My mind instantly flashed back to the last few days. I remembered feeling incredibly lethargic since the dinner. I remembered the sudden, severe bouts of brain fog, the inexplicable dizziness, and the way my limbs felt incredibly heavy. I had innocently blamed it all on the stress of the wedding and my advancing age. But I was not just aging. I was being systematically poisoned by my own family. I shook my head, holding my hand up to stop Marcus from calling an ambulance. I forced myself to stand up straight, pulling a deep breath of air into my lungs. Decades of surviving ruthless corporate negotiations and navigating vicious business competitors suddenly took over my mind. The initial, crushing shock began to rapidly recede, entirely replaced by a cold, blinding, and absolute rage. If my wife and my son thought I was just some clueless, tired old man they could easily dispose of to steal my empire, they had severely underestimated their target. The sadness vanished, leaving behind only the sharp, predatory instincts of a man ready to go to war. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a transparent plastic evidence bag. Inside was a tiny glass vial with a black rubber stopper. He slid it across the metal desk. The faint scraping sound seemed deafening in the quiet room. He told me the overnight cleaning crew had found it tucked deep inside the trash bin of the women's restroom just after our party ended. I stared at the vial. It was no larger than my thumb, yet looking at it, I felt a phantom burn tracing down my throat. The reality of the footage had been an abstract horror, but this small piece of glass made it viscerally real. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as the finality of the situation fully set in. I had swallowed every last drop of whatever chemical had been inside that container. I picked up the plastic bag, my fingers gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Marcus asked if I wanted him to contact the authorities. I shook my head slowly. I told him to erase all records of my visit, keep the footage strictly secure, and never speak of this to anyone. I thanked him for his loyalty and walked out of the security office. The cold Cleveland air hit my face as I stepped out of the restaurant and walked toward my car in silence. I sat in the driver's seat and locked the doors, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Every primal instinct in my body screamed at me to drive straight home, kick the front door off its hinges, and drag my wife out of her bed. I wanted to shake her, to demand how she could erase 35 years of marriage for a financial payout. But the man who built a commercial real estate empire from dirt and concrete did not survive by throwing tantrums. I survived by outsmarting my enemies. Anger is a useless emotion if it lacks a strategy. I needed undeniable scientific proof before I made a single move. I started the engine and drove away from my neighborhood. A public hospital would require insurance documents and reporting protocols that would alert my family. Instead, I drove toward the private medical district on the west side of the city. I needed absolute secrecy, and I was willing to pay whatever price they demanded. I pulled up to a discreet, 24-hour private toxicology clinic that my corporate lawyers occasionally used for sensitive executive evaluations. The waiting room was sterile and empty. A tired receptionist looked up from her computer as I approached the counter. I did not give my real name. I told her I required an immediate, comprehensive chemical analysis of an unknown substance residue, along with a full heavy metals and synthetic drug screening of my own blood. She politely informed me that standard processing took up to 5 business days and required proper medical referrals. I reached into my coat, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote a check for $10,000. I slid it across the counter and told her I needed the results rushed, off the books, delivered directly to my secure private email by tomorrow morning. Money always talks in Cleveland. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in an examination room. A silent nurse drew 4 vials of my blood. I handed over the plastic bag containing the empty glass vial. I watched the nurse label everything with a random barcode. The entire process was clinical and detached, a stark contrast to the emotional devastation tearing through my chest. As the needle pierced my vein, I stared at my own dark blood filling the plastic tubes. I wondered how much poison was currently coursing through my system. I wondered how long my wife and my son had been lacing my life with their toxic ambition. I forced myself to remain stoic and still. I left the private clinic just as the early morning traffic began to build. The sun was rising over Lake Erie, casting a golden light across the city skyline. It looked like the beginning of a beautiful day, but for me, it felt like stepping into a cold graveyard. I arrived back at my Shaker Heights mansion shortly after 7 o'clock. The house was silent. The massive crystal chandelier in the grand foyer caught the morning light, illuminating the marble floors and the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. I had bought all of this for them. I had spent my entire life making sure they never knew the bitter taste of poverty, and they repaid me by plotting my execution in a private dining room. I climbed the grand staircase and walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I paused outside the wooden doors, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The bedroom was submerged in shadows, the blackout curtains tightly drawn against the morning sun. Marlene was asleep on her side of our California king bed. The rhythmic, peaceful sound of her breathing filled the room. I stood at the foot of the bed and stared at her. She looked so serene, so innocent. Her soft blonde hair was draped across the silk pillowcases. This was the woman who had smiled at me across the dinner table. This was the woman who had kissed my cheek before turning around to order my death. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I removed my shoes, my coat, and my watch. I slid into the bed beside her, carefully pulling the duvet over my chest. I stared at the ceiling, feeling an intense chill, that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Lying next to a cold-blooded murderer is a terrifying experience. The physical proximity was suffocating. I could feel the warmth radiating from her sleeping body. I could smell the faint trace of her lavender perfume, a scent that had comforted me for decades. Now, it made my stomach churn with nausea. Every time she shifted, every time the fabric of her silk pajamas brushed against my leg, my muscles tensed with a primal fear. I was sharing a bed with a predator, and I knew I had to pretend to be the prey. I stared blankly up at the dark bedroom ceiling. The heavy tension in the room was dense enough to choke on. I realized that my survival depended on my ability to act oblivious. I had to smile. I had to complain about my fading memory. I had to swallow whatever harmless excuses they would feed me. I had to play the part of a dying, confused old man until my trap was set. I lay there in the cold darkness for hours, quietly listening to the slow, steady breathing of the woman who secretly wanted me dead. I waited for the morning sun to finally rise, mentally bracing myself for the exact moment she would wake up, look directly into my eyes, and comfortably lie to my face. I knew the real war was just beginning right now, and I was more than ready to fiercely fight it. The morning sun finally pierced through the heavy blackout curtains, signaling the start of a day I had to endure with a mask of complete ignorance. Marlene stirred beside me, stretching her arms and letting out a soft yawn. She turned her head, offering me a warm, loving smile that completely contradicted the absolute horror I had witnessed on that security monitor just hours before. I forced the muscles in my face to form a gentle smile in return. I kissed her forehead, an act that required every ounce of willpower I possessed. I told her I was going downstairs to start the coffee and prepare for our scheduled Sunday brunch. My voice was incredibly calm, giving away absolutely none of the violent turmoil raging inside my chest. I walked into the master bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection. I had to look the part of a wealthy, aging patriarch who was slowly losing his grip on reality. I had to make them feel utterly confident in their sinister plan. I descended the grand staircase and made my way into our expansive kitchen. Our private chef had already laid out an impressive spread of pastries, fresh fruit, and roasted salmon on the formal dining table. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the heavy oak front door swung open. Preston and Vivian walked into the foyer, their voices echoing brightly against the marble floors. They looked like the perfect young couple, stepping straight out of a bridal magazine. Vivienne was holding a bouquet of fresh lilies, and Preston carried a bottle of imported champagne. They greeted Marlene with bright laughter and warm hugs. When Preston approached me, he threw his arms around my shoulders and gave me a firm, affectionate embrace. He thanked me again for the incredible rehearsal dinner the night before. I patted his back, feeling the solid muscle beneath his expensive linen shirt, completely nauseated by the profound depth of his treachery. I welcomed my daughter-in-law, complimenting her radiant glow, all while knowing she was the woman who calmly poured liquid death into my glass. We gathered around the large mahogany dining table, the morning light streaming brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The atmosphere was sickeningly cheerful. Marlene poured coffee, while Preston regaled us with exaggerated stories about the eccentric relatives who had attended the dinner. Vivian laughed politely at all the right moments, delicately slicing a piece of fruit on her porcelain plate. I sat at the head of the table, sipping my black coffee, observing them with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. They were so confident in their deception, so completely comfortable in their roles, that they did not notice the subtle, calculating silence emanating from my end of the table. I needed to see how they would react when pressured. I needed to witness the architecture of their lie firsthand. I waited for the perfect moment to disrupt their comfortable morning routine and introduce the first element of doubt. Halfway through the meal, I decided it was time to spring the trap. I reached for my water glass, intentionally making my hand tremble violently. I purposefully misjudged the distance, knocking the heavy crystal glass against my plate with a loud, disruptive clatter. I let out a sudden, sharp gasp and pressed my hand firmly against my temple. I closed my eyes tightly and slumped heavily into my chair, playing the role of a man suddenly overcome by severe vertigo. The cheerful conversation at the table abruptly stopped. I groaned quietly, massaging the bridge of my nose, and let my breathing become labored and heavy. I waited for a few agonizing seconds, letting the manufactured tension fill the dining room. Then, I slowly opened my eyes and looked at them with a fabricated expression of deep confusion and vulnerability. I lowered my voice to a raspy whisper and said that my head was spinning wildly. I told them I had been feeling incredibly strange since last night. I paused, ensuring I had their complete and undivided attention. I carefully formed my next words. I said my drink tasted incredibly bitter at the dinner, almost chemical, and I asked if anyone had seen someone tamper with my glass while I was away from the table. The deployment of their lie was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. Marlene did not miss a single beat. She immediately pushed her chair back and rushed to my side, dropping to her knees and grabbing my trembling hands. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated concern. She rubbed my knuckles gently and let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. She looked at me with tender, worried eyes and asked me how I could possibly forget our conversation from yesterday. She reminded me, with a patronizingly sweet tone, of what my cardiologist had strictly ordered during my last checkup. She said I was absolutely forbidden from drinking hard liquor while taking my new blood pressure medications. Marlene gently stroked my cheek and explained that they were all just terribly worried about my health. She said that Vivian, out of the goodness of her heart, had brought a specialized homeopathic liver detox extract to the dinner. Since I had stubbornly refused to stop drinking, Marlene claimed she had asked Vivian to slip the herbal drops into my scotch to help protect my system. Vivian chimed in flawlessly to support the narrative. She placed her hand over her heart and offered me a look of deep, apologetic sincerity. She said she felt terrible for making the drink taste so bitter, but she was only trying to follow Marlene's instructions to keep me healthy. She promised she would never use those specific herbal drops again if they made me feel so disoriented. It was a beautifully constructed narrative. It provided a completely plausible, innocent explanation for the exact event I had witnessed on the security footage. It transformed an act of lethal poisoning into a heartwarming tale of a family desperately trying to care for their aging patriarch. Then, Preston delivered the final, twisting blow. He leaned across the table, his face painted with a look of exhausted patience and deep concern. He told me that we had already discussed the herbal drops in the car ride home last night. He gently suggested that my memory was really starting to slip, and that maybe my sudden dizzy spells were a sign of my failing memory. He gaslighted me with such profound, earnest conviction that, had I not seen the empty vial and ordered a secret blood test, I might have actually believed him. I might have doubted my own sanity and surrendered to their twisted narrative completely. But the unyielding truth remained locked safely inside my mind, far beyond their treacherous reach. I knew I had to maintain this delicate charade until my absolute victory was utterly guaranteed and finalized. I offered them a weak, apologetic smile, pretending to accept their ridiculous explanation, while a fire of pure hatred burned violently in my chest. They thought they had won the game. They had no idea they had just awakened a sleeping monster. I forced my shoulders to relax, letting a heavy sigh escape my lips, as if a massive burden had been lifted from my aging mind. I looked at Preston, Vivian, and my wife, Marlene. I made sure my eyes projected nothing but profound relief. I reached across the table and squeezed Marlene's hand. I told her I was sorry for causing a foolish scene, and that I was lucky to have a family who watched out for my stubborn habits. I thanked Vivian for caring enough to protect my health, even if her herbal remedy gave me a scare. Vivian beamed, her smile radiant and devoid of guilt. She told me it was no trouble, and she just wanted me around for a long time. The audacity of her statement almost made my hands shake, but I kept my grip steady. We spent the next hour finishing brunch, engaging in meaningless small talk about their upcoming honeymoon and renovations for their new house, a house I paid for in full. I chewed my food, swallowed my pride, and played the compliant, confused patriarch. Finally, Preston announced they needed to leave. Marlene walked them to the grand entryway, kissing Preston and hugging Vivian. I stood by the door, waving goodbye like a proud father. I watched Preston's luxury sedan disappear down the street. I waited until the heavy oak door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid into place. My gentle smile vanished, replaced by a rigid grimace. Marlene suggested I go upstairs to sleep off the dizzy spell. I agreed, telling her I felt exhausted and needed rest. I walked slowly up the curved staircase, gripping the banister, fully aware that Marlene was watching me from the foyer. I entered the master bedroom, closed the double doors, and locked them. I did not go to the bed. Instead, I walked straight into my closet and retrieved the prepaid cellular phone I had purchased earlier that morning. I sat down on a velvet bench in the back of the closet, staring at the blank screen. The silence in the house was oppressive. I waited for what felt like hours, my mind replaying Vivian's poisonous voice. Exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the burner phone vibrated violently in my hand. The glowing screen displayed a restricted number. I pressed the answer button and brought the receiver to my ear. A clinical, deeply serious voice spoke on the other end. It was the lead toxicologist from the private laboratory. He asked me to confirm my identity, using the secure numeric passcode we established at the front desk. I recited the numbers clearly. The doctor let out a heavy breath and told me he had personally overseen the expedited chemical breakdown of the liquid residue found inside the glass vial, as well as the comprehensive screening of my blood samples. He asked if I was sitting down in a secure location where no one could overhear our conversation. I told him I was completely alone and to give me the exact results without sugarcoating a single detail. The doctor's tone became incredibly grim. He stated categorically that the substance inside the vial was not a homeopathic liver detox or any natural herbal remedy. He explained that they had isolated a highly sophisticated, synthetic chemical cocktail. The primary active ingredient was a concentrated dose of liquid lorazepam, a powerful central nervous system depressant designed to cause severe lethargy, confusion, and immediate short-term memory loss. But that was only the first half of the formula. The doctor explained that the lorazepam was merely the delivery system, designed to mask the true purpose of the poison. The secondary compound was a rare, synthetic neuromuscular blocking agent. He explained that this specific chemical is almost impossible to obtain through legal medical channels. When ingested over a period of time, it deliberately degrades cognitive function, mimicking the rapid and tragic onset of severe dementia. It attacks the brain's synapses, making the victim appear entirely detached from reality. But the most terrifying aspect of the chemical was its effect on the cardiovascular system. The doctor told me that this agent slowly builds up microscopic blockages inside the heart muscle. Over the course of a few months, it weakens the cardiac tissue until it inevitably triggers a massive, fatal myocardial infarction. Because the chemical breaks down rapidly in the bloodstream after death, a standard coroner's autopsy would rule the death as a completely natural heart attack brought on by old age and early-stage dementia. The doctor paused, letting the clinical horror of his explanation settle over me. He then confirmed the final, crushing detail. My blood panels showed elevated levels of this exact chemical cocktail. They had been dosing me for weeks. The doctor strongly urged me to contact federal law enforcement immediately, offering to forward his official reports to any investigative agency I chose. I thanked him for his extreme discretion and instructed him to hold the physical reports in a secure vault until I contacted him again. I ended the call and tossed the burner phone onto the plush carpet of my closet. I sat alone in the dim light, my breathing slow and measured. The profound magnitude of their betrayal washed over me like a freezing tidal wave. Every symptom I experienced over the last 2 months suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The mornings I woke up, unable to remember simple conversations with my staff. The afternoons, my legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. The moments I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen, struggling to recall basic financial figures. I had genuinely believed I was losing my edge, that the ruthless march of time was finally claiming my brilliant mind. I had even cried in the shower a month ago, terrified that I was slowly becoming a burden to the wife and son I loved deeply. It was not age. It was a calculated euthanasia. They were murdering me in slow motion. Marlene was serving me poison with my morning coffee. Preston was watching me stumble through our board meetings, relishing my confusion. And Vivian was the dedicated pharmacist, ensuring the dosage was precisely lethal. They did not just want my money. They wanted to strip my dignity, erase my intellect, and watch me degrade into a helpless invalid before my heart exploded in my chest. They wanted to stand at my lavish funeral, wipe away fake tears, and inherit my empire while the world pitied the tragic end of poor Walter. I stood up from the velvet bench, leaving the darkness of the closet and stepping into the natural light. I walked over to the large mirror hanging above Marlene's pristine vanity. I stared at the man looking back at me. The gray hair, the lines etched deep into my face, the signs of a life spent fighting for every inch of ground I conquered. I placed my hands against the cold marble countertop. The sadness, the lingering remnants of paternal love and marital devotion evaporated entirely. They were burned away by a cold, immaculate fury. I was not going to quietly fade away. I was going to dismantle their lives, block by block, until they had nothing left but the consequences of their limitless greed. The morning after my realization, the deadly routine continued exactly as it had for months. I walked into the bedroom, shuffling my feet and letting my shoulders slump toward the floor. Marlene was awake, sitting on the edge of the large bed in her expensive silk robe. On the silver tray resting on my nightstand, next to a glass of orange juice, sat a porcelain dish containing my vitamins. I looked at the assortment of capsules and tablets. Sitting among the harmless fish oil and multivitamins were two unfamiliar white pills. I had mindlessly swallowed those exact pills every single day for months, completely trusting the hands that gave them to me. Now, I knew they were loaded with the synthetic nerve depressant. Marlene smiled her practiced smile and handed me the dish. She told me I needed to swallow them to keep my strength up for the busy week ahead. I took the dish with a convincingly trembling hand. I raised it to my mouth, tipping my head back, and expertly palmed the two dangerous white pills while tossing the harmless vitamins into my mouth. I drank the orange juice, swallowing loudly, and offered her a quiet, grateful nod. The moment she turned her back to slip into her dressing room, I wrapped the poisonous pills in a tissue and shoved them deep into the pocket of my slacks. Later, I would crush them into powder and wash them down the bathroom sink drain while the hot water ran high. Disposing of the daily poison was the easy part. Surviving the sudden chemical withdrawal without alerting my assassins proved to be an excruciating physical ordeal. My body had grown completely dependent on the heavy daily doses of the potent lorazepam and the synthetic neuromuscular blockers. By the second evening of abstaining from the lethal pills, the withdrawal symptoms began to fiercely manifest. I was sitting in my leather armchair in our living room when a violent, uncontrollable tremor started in my left hand. A clammy sweat broke out across the back of my neck and saturated my chest. My heart raced erratically, pounding against my ribs like a desperate, trapped bird, fighting to urgently escape. I forced myself to remain completely seated, gripping the armrests so tightly my aching fingers instantly turned white. I was absolutely desperate to conceal the violent physical shaking from Marlene, who was quietly reading a fashion magazine just a few feet away on the sofa. I quickly excused myself, claiming a sudden wave of fatigue, and locked myself inside the adjacent guest bathroom. I collapsed onto the cold tile floor, clutching my cramping stomach tightly, as consecutive waves of intense nausea violently washed over my body. For 3 agonizing days, I endured severe muscle cramps, blinding migraines, and a persistent, truly terrifying sensation of relentless vertigo. I masked the severe chemical withdrawal by convincing my family I had contracted a lingering stomach flu. It was a brilliant lie that Marlene eagerly accepted, assuming it was simply another pathetic symptom of my rapidly failing, intentionally poisoned physical body. I spent countless hours lying completely motionless in bed, violently shivering under heavy wool blankets, forcefully biting my tongue until it bled to keep from crying out in actual pain. But halfway through the excruciating physical torment, something wonderfully miraculous began happening. The thick, suffocating chemical fog that had relentlessly clouded my brain for agonizing months was slowly beginning to permanently dissipate. By the silent dawn of the 5th morning, I woke up long before the sun, and the internal change was miraculously profound. I slowly opened my eyes in the dark bedroom, and for the very first time, in what honestly felt like an absolute lifetime, my conscious thoughts were undeniably razor-sharp. The heavy, sluggish lethargy that bound my body was entirely eradicated. My profound memory, which they had tried so desperately and systematically to erase, returned with a ferocious, breathtaking clarity. I could perfectly remember the exact details of complex corporate development contracts I had personally negotiated a full decade ago. I could instantly recall the specific, highly secure routing numbers of my various hidden offshore bank accounts. I could easily calculate immense financial algorithms directly in my head in mere fleeting seconds. My brilliant mind was once again a flawless, impenetrable steel trap. The rapid return of my formidable cognitive brilliance was deeply intoxicating. It delivered a powerful, surging rush of pure adrenaline that completely eliminated any lingering physical weakness. I lay perfectly still there, in the quiet room, fully relishing the sheer, unadulterated power of my own revitalized intellect. I was absolutely no longer a confused, desperately dying old man. I was Walter, the ruthless commercial real estate titan who had mercilessly crushed rival developers and built an unbelievable financial empire from literally nothing. But I implicitly knew I could not let a single ounce of this incredible restored vitality visually show. My physical survival and my ultimate vengeance depended entirely on flawlessly maintaining the pathetic, crumbling facade they had maliciously engineered for me. With my powerful mind fully clear, I purposefully began to fiercely observe my immediate environment with the hyper-focused intensity of an apex predator. Playing the role of the helpless, confused victim quickly became a meticulously calculated performance. I began to quietly notice the subtle, chillingly dark micro-expressions frequently playing across Marlene's face. When I intentionally asked her the exact same simple question 3 consecutive times in a single hour, convincingly pretending to forget her previous answers, the sweet mask of the eternally doting wife would momentarily slip. Her tense jaw would clench tightly. A sharp, incredibly ugly flash of pure impatience and absolute unmasked disgust would instantly narrow her cold eyes before she quickly forced the sickeningly condescending smile right back onto her lying lips. She deeply hated playing the role of the devoted caretaker, and she was growing increasingly desperate for the bitter end to finally arrive. But the most horrifying, soul-crushing observations routinely occurred in the silent pitch of the darkest night. I would deliberately lie perfectly still in our bed, expertly slowing my breathing rhythm to flawlessly mimic a deep, exceptionally heavy slumber. In the quiet hours past midnight, I would frequently feel the heavy mattress softly shift beside me. Marlene would quietly lean over me in the suffocating dark. I could vividly feel her icy fingers gently pressing directly against the side of my exposed neck, positioned right over my vulnerable carotid artery. She was not checking on my physical well-being. She was clinically monitoring my fading pulse, silently waiting and deeply hoping for the steady beating of my heart to finally, permanently cease. The terrifying tension of lying completely motionless while my treacherous wife eagerly checked to see if I was actually dead yet was utterly indescribable. Every single time her chilling fingers touched my bare skin, the absolute, burning hatred I silently harbored for her multiplied exponentially. She eagerly wanted me buried 6 feet beneath the cold ground, but she had absolutely no idea that I was entirely wide awake, flawlessly tracking her every single subtle movement, and ruthlessly preparing to bury her and her evil accomplices first. The following Tuesday, I decided it was time to examine the financial perimeter of my life. I dressed in a classic navy suit, intentionally leaving my tie slightly askew, and my hair just messy enough to maintain the illusion of a man struggling to hold his life together. I drove my sedan through the bustling morning traffic of downtown Cleveland, heading straight for the sleek, 60-story glass tower that housed my commercial real estate firm. I had purchased the land decades ago, pouring my sweat and intellect into transforming it into a crown jewel of the city skyline. Walking through the revolving doors of the grand lobby, I felt a familiar surge of pride, instantly followed by a sickening wave of apprehension. The young receptionist at the front desk practically jumped out of her chair when she saw me approaching. She nervously stammered a greeting, her eyes darting toward the telephone, as if warning someone of an impending natural disaster. I offered a vacuous smile and waved her off, shuffling past the security turnstiles with the unsteady gait of a fragile elder. The vibrant energy of the executive floor immediately halted as I stepped out of the private elevator. Junior associates and senior partners alike stopped their conversations, staring at me with a mixture of pity and shock. They had clearly been fed a specific narrative about my declining health. I ignored their whispers and made my way toward the main boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors were slightly open. I slipped inside without making a sound. Preston was sitting at the head of the massive conference table, occupying the exact leather chair I had commanded for over 30 years. He was addressing the executive board with a supreme, unearned arrogance. He confidently gestured toward a projected spreadsheet, outlining aggressive restructuring plans and asset liquidations that I had never authorized. I cleared my throat loudly, letting my voice crack just enough to sound pathetic. The entire room froze. Preston stopped speaking, his face flashing with genuine panic, before rapidly smoothing into a mask of patronizing concern. He quickly stood up, walked over to me, and placed a heavy, condescending hand on my shoulder. He looked at the board members and offered them a sad, apologetic sigh, communicating that the crazy old man had wandered out again. He loudly asked me what I was doing downtown, speaking with the slow, exaggerated articulation one might use for a lost toddler. I maintained my vacant stare. I mumbled something incoherent about wanting to review the quarterly revenue reports and missing the energy of the office. Preston chuckled softly, a cruel sound that echoed in the silent room. He told the board we would take a brief recess, then gently guided me out into the hallway. He squeezed my arm tight enough to cause pain, dropping the concerned son act entirely. He hissed under his breath, demanding to know why I had embarrassed him in front of the senior partners. He told me I had no business being at the firm in my current mental state, and that he was handling everything just fine without my interference. I simply nodded, looking down at the carpet, apologizing meekly for disrupting his important work. I asked him if I could just sit quietly in my old office for a while, to rest before I took a taxi home. Preston rolled his eyes, utterly disgusted by my perceived weakness. He agreed, telling me to stay put and out of sight while he finished his presentation. The moment he marched back into the boardroom and closed the doors, my hunched posture vanished. I walked purposefully past my old office and headed straight for the executive suite Preston had recently claimed as his own. The door was locked, a standard security protocol. But I had designed this entire building. I slipped a master key card from my wallet, a relic from the initial construction phase that I never surrendered to building management. The electronic lock clicked green, and I stepped inside, quietly shutting the door behind me. Preston's office was a testament to unearned wealth, filled with expensive modern art and imported furniture. But I was not interested in his decorating choices. I moved directly to his desk and woke up his computer monitor. The login screen prompted for a password. Preston was meticulous, regularly updating his security credentials, but he was completely unaware of the fundamental architecture of the company's network. When I first established the digital infrastructure decades ago, I secretly coded an administrative backdoor access portal into the root directory. It was a failsafe designed for ultimate emergencies, granting me invisible, unrestricted access to every single terminal in the building. I typed the complex string of characters into the hidden prompt. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before the desktop fully loaded, bypassing all of Preston's localized security protocols. I rapidly navigated through his personal network drives, my eyes scanning the directories with the speed of a seasoned corporate raider. I bypassed the standard operational folders and dug deep into a heavily encrypted partition labeled with a generic numerical sequence. Inside, I found a staggering collection of legal and financial documents that made my blood freeze in my veins. Preston was not simply acting as a temporary steward of my company while I supposedly recovered from an illness. He was actively looting the entire empire. I opened a massive spreadsheet that tracked the transfer of our most valuable commercial assets. He had quietly severed our ownership of 3 downtown high-rises, 2 suburban retail complexes, and a massive industrial park. The deeds had been systematically transferred out of the corporate holding company and moved directly into a newly established private trust fund. I clicked on the foundational documents for the new trust, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. The trust was perfectly insulated, invisible to standard auditing procedures, and governed by aggressive clauses designed to bypass any probate challenges. But the true horror was hidden in the beneficiary designations. The trust did not name Preston as the primary recipient. It named a holding company registered in Nevada, a corporate shell designed to completely obscure the actual owner of the stolen funds. Preston was liquidating the very foundation of my life's work, siphoning the staggering wealth I had built into a shadow entity while grinning in my face and playing the devoted son. The sheer magnitude of the financial betrayal rivaled the lethal poison they were feeding me every morning. They were dismantling my life, piece by piece, intent on leaving me with absolutely nothing before my heart finally stopped beating. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my cold eyes. I carefully backed out of the system, meticulously erasing my digital footprints to ensure Preston would never know I had breached his fortress. I left the office, slipping back out into the hallway, just as the boardroom doors began to open. I had arrived at the building, searching for mere confirmation of my suspicions, but I was leaving with a comprehensive blueprint of their entire criminal enterprise. I knew exactly what I needed to do next to secure my total revenge. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my Shaker Heights mansion, just as the late afternoon sun began to cast long golden shadows across the marble foyer. Marlene was out at one of her weekly charity luncheons, leaving the massive house mercifully empty. Or so I thought. As I handed my coat to the housekeeper, she quietly informed me that Vivian had stopped by to drop off some fabric swatches for the upcoming master bedroom renovation. I nodded, feigning mild confusion, and slowly shuffled toward the solarium where Vivian was supposedly waiting. My mind was still reeling from the staggering financial betrayal I had just uncovered on the hidden computer server. The intricate web of shadow corporations and illicit trust funds proved that my son was not acting alone. He lacked the sophisticated criminal intellect required to construct such an airtight laundering operation. He needed a seasoned architect. As I approached the open glass doors of the sunroom, the pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together. Vivienne was standing by the large bay windows, bathed in the warm afternoon light. She was dressed in her typical attire, a modest cashmere sweater, and pearls, projecting the flawless image of a sweet, highly educated girl from a respectable Portland family. She had always played the part of the innocent, demure fiancé to absolute perfection. But with my cognitive brilliance fully restored, and my senses functioning at their absolute peak, the facade was suddenly glaringly obvious. It was too perfect, too meticulously curated. I stepped into the room, intentionally dragging my feet against the floorboards to announce my arrival. Vivian spun around, her face instantly breaking into a bright, welcoming smile. She rushed over, wrapping her arms around me in a gentle embrace, asking how I was feeling after my confusing morning at the firm. I offered a weak, tired smile, and told her I was just feeling a little disoriented. As she pulled away to guide me toward a velvet armchair, she reached out to steady my elbow. For a fraction of a second, the sleeve of her cashmere sweater rode up her forearm. My eyes locked onto the pale skin of her inner wrist. Beneath the delicate gold bracelet she always wore, there was a faint, slightly raised pattern of scarred tissue. It was the undeniable mark of a heavily laser-removed tattoo, but it was not a careless teenage mistake or a faded butterfly. The rigid geometric lines of the residual scarring formed a very specific, highly recognizable shape. During my aggressive expansion into the commercial real estate markets of the Pacific Northwest, decades ago, I had dealt with numerous unsavory syndicates and organized criminal enterprises. I recognized that specific geometric shape immediately. It was the insignia of a notorious, deeply violent transnational smuggling syndicate operating out of the western seaboard. The sweet, innocent girl from Portland was carrying the branded mark of a hardened criminal organization. The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train, but I kept my facial expression completely blank. I thanked her for helping me to the chair and asked her to fetch me a glass of iced water from the kitchen. As soon as she turned her back and walked down the hallway, I stood up from the armchair. The sudden realization that my son had unknowingly, or perhaps willingly, brought a seasoned criminal operative into our home chilled me to the bone. Vivienne was not just a greedy fiancée. She was the master chemist dosing my morning vitamins, and she was undoubtedly the financial architect behind the offshore holding companies draining my corporate assets. I quietly moved toward the French doors leading out to the rear stone balcony. I needed to observe her when she thought she was entirely alone. I slipped behind the heavy silk drapes, concealing my presence in the shadows. and waited. A few minutes later, Vivienne returned to the solarium with a crystal glass of water. Finding the room empty, her sweet, gentle demeanor instantly vanished. The soft, elegant posture she always maintained evaporated, replaced by a rigid, aggressive stance. She pulled a small, black burner phone from the pocket of her designer slacks. I held my breath, listening intently as she dialed a number and pressed the phone to her ear. Her voice, usually so melodic and soft, dropped into a harsh, commanding register. The vocabulary she used was not the language of a 28-year-old planning a luxury wedding. It was the precise, clinical terminology of a high-level money launderer. She spoke rapidly, her tone clipped, and completely devoid of emotion. She demanded immediate confirmation that the latest asset liquidation had been successfully routed through the Nevada holding company. She aggressively questioned the receiving party about the specific tax insulation clauses within the newly established trust fund, explicitly instructing them to bypass the standard auditing triggers. I listened in absolute horror as she casually discussed the systematic dismantling of my commercial real estate empire. She authorized the movement of millions of dollars with the cold, detached efficiency of a ruthless corporate raider. She was directing the entire operation, maneuvering Preston like a foolish, arrogant pawn on a grand chessboard. She paced back and forth across the stone balcony, her voice growing increasingly agitated. She told the person on the other end of the line that the timeline needed to be significantly accelerated. She explicitly stated that my cognitive decline was not progressing fast enough, and she was going to have to increase the chemical dosage to finalize the biological collapse before the end of the fiscal quarter. Hearing her refer to my impending death as a mere biological collapse to be scheduled alongside a quarterly financial report sent a fresh wave of blinding fury crashing through my veins. She was casually scheduling my murder to maximize their financial extraction. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy drapes, memorizing every single illicit banking term, every hidden routing protocol, and every ruthless command she issued. The sweet, polite girl from Portland was an apex predator, a sociopathic parasite who had infiltrated my family to consume my life savings. Vivienne abruptly ended the call, snapping the burner phone shut and slipping it back into her pocket. I watched her take a deep, centering breath. In a matter of seconds, her rigid posture softened. The harshness melted from her face, replaced once again by the mask of the innocent, caring daughter-in-law. She picked up the glass of water and called out my name in that sickeningly sweet, melodic voice, pretending to search the house for her confused, wandering father-in-law. I waited until her footsteps faded down the hallway before I stepped out from behind the drapes. The pieces of the puzzle were now fully assembled. Marlene was blinded by her own bitter greed. Preston was blinded by his unearned arrogance, and Vivienne was manipulating them both to execute a flawless, lethal, hostile takeover. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the man they were trying to kill. The real war had officially begun, and I was going to utterly destroy every single one of them tonight. I waited patiently, in the suffocating darkness of our master bedroom, lying rigidly next to the woman who wanted me dead. I regulated my breathing, ensuring every inhale and exhale mimicked the deep, rhythmic cadence of a heavily sedated old man. Marlene was asleep, her chest rising and falling in peaceful, uninterrupted intervals. The sheer audacity of her peaceful slumber fueled the burning furnace in my mind. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I carefully slipped out from under the heavy silk duvet. I placed my bare feet onto the plush carpet, moving with the practiced silence of a ghost haunting its own home. I grabbed my velvet robe, wrapped it tightly around my shoulders to ward off the chill of the air conditioning, and slowly opened the heavy oak door. The hallway was completely dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the tall windows. I navigated the familiar layout of my mansion by sheer memory, descending the grand staircase and making my way toward the west wing where my private home office was located. My home office had always been my absolute sanctuary, a room strictly off-limits to the rest of the family. However, given their relentless infiltration of my life, I knew those boundaries had likely been violated long ago. I turned the brass handle and slipped inside, quietly clicking the lock into place behind me. The room was submerged in shadows. I did not turn on the main chandelier or even the small brass desk lamp. Instead, I retrieved a tiny, localized penlight from my robe pocket. I clicked the button, casting a narrow, concentrated beam of white light across the rich mahogany floorboards. I moved directly toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that dominated the back wall. Behind a row of antique leather-bound encyclopedias hid the biometric wall safe, where I kept my most sensitive personal estate documents. I gently pulled the heavy books aside, revealing the cold steel face of the vault. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing green scanner. The mechanism whirred quietly, and the heavy metal door popped open with a soft, satisfying click. I reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a thick, legal-sized leather portfolio. This portfolio was supposed to contain my ironclad last will and testament, my original healthcare proxy directives, and the foundational framework of my immense legacy. I carried the heavy folder over to my desk, sat down in my leather executive chair, and unfastened the brass clasp. I directed the narrow beam of the penlight onto the first page. Instantly, a cold, sickening realization washed over me. The thick, textured paper felt entirely wrong. The official embossed seals looked slightly different, and the font typography did not match the specific formatting my corporate lawyers strictly utilized. I rapidly flipped through the dense legal pages, my eyes scanning the intricate paragraphs with the blistering speed of a man fighting for his absolute survival. Every single document inside the portfolio was a meticulously crafted forgery. They had completely gutted my original estate planning directives and replaced them with a massive, highly sophisticated network of shadow trusts. I stared at the signatures at the bottom of the pages. They were a brilliant, almost flawless imitation of my own distinct handwriting. But I possessed a photographic memory for my own penmanship, and I could spot the microscopic hesitations in the ink strokes. Someone had spent countless hours practicing my signature, carefully perfecting the exact angle of every loop and curve. I thought back to Vivian and the hardened criminal syndicate tattoo scarred onto her wrist. She was undeniably the master forger behind this extensive operation. I continued digging deeper into the stack of heavy parchment, desperately searching for the central mechanism of their grand financial theft. I needed to understand exactly how they planned to extract the liquid wealth from the commercial properties Preston had secretly transferred. I found the answer buried in the third addendum of a newly established corporate holding trust. The document was titled with a generic sequence of numbers designed to look like a standard administrative file, but the legal language contained within the paragraphs was breathtakingly aggressive and entirely malicious. The new trust was designed to hold the vast majority of my liquid financial assets, a staggering sum totaling $50 million in cash and high-yield bonds. I traced my finger down the page, illuminating the specific activation clauses with my penlight. The trust was not designed to activate upon my death. It was explicitly structured to activate upon my formal medical incapacitation, the moment a licensed physician declared me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. The entire $50 million trust would instantly unlock and transfer full operational control to a designated beneficiary. I flipped the page, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs as I searched for the name of the beneficiary. I fully expected to see Preston's name, or perhaps Marlene's name, listed as the primary financial custodian. But when the narrow beam of light hit the bold, black ink, my breath caught in my throat. The sole legal beneficiary, the only person granted absolute unilateral authority over $50 million, was Vivian. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together with a deafening, terrifying clarity. This was not a simple family betrayal. This was a highly orchestrated, professional heist. Preston was merely a useful idiot, a greedy, arrogant pawn who thought he was securing his own inheritance by transferring the commercial properties. Marlene was a bitter, impatient accomplice, willing to poison her husband for an early payout. But Vivian was the true mastermind. She had seduced my foolish son, infiltrated my home, and slowly poisoned me to mimic the exact symptoms of severe dementia. She needed me alive, just long enough to be formally diagnosed as medically incompetent. The very second the doctors declared my brain broken, she would seize total control of the $50 million trust. She would effortlessly empty the accounts, liquidate the offshore bonds, and vanish into the wind, leaving Preston and Marlene holding the empty shell of a ruined empire. She would simply disappear, a ghost with $50 million, while I slowly suffocated to death from a chemically induced heart attack. I sat in the cold, silent darkness of my home office, the magnitude of the conspiracy radiating through my veins like electricity. The sheer brilliance of her plan was almost admirable, but she had made the fatal mistake of underestimating my resilience. She thought she was quietly euthanizing an oblivious, decaying old man. She did not realize she had inadvertently awakened a completely ruthless, highly calculating adversary. I carefully reorganized the forged documents, ensuring every single page was placed exactly as I had found it. I closed the thick leather portfolio, fastened the brass clasp, and returned the heavy folder to the concealed biometric wall safe. I closed the steel door, letting the mechanism lock with a definitive click, and slid the antique books back into their original, undisturbed positions. I turned off the penlight, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. I walked back upstairs, navigating the silent, moonlit hallways with a renewed sense of terrifying purpose. I slipped back into the master bedroom, removed my velvet robe, and climbed into the large bed beside my treacherous wife. I pulled the silk duvet up to my chin and stared at the ceiling, my mind calculating 1,000 different variables per second. I was going to let them play out their little medical drama. I was going to let them schedule the doctor's appointment. I was going to let Vivian believe she was inches away from securing her $50 million prize. And when they finally thought they had won, when they reached out to claim their stolen fortune, I was going to spring a trap so devastating, so completely destructive, that it would shatter their entire existence. I closed my eyes, welcoming the cold, calculating clarity of my absolute sobriety, entirely ready for the final battle. The morning sun brought a strange sense of tranquility. I rose from the bed, my muscles stiff, but my mind sharper than a polished razor. Marlene stirred, offering her usual sleepy smile, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sharing a bed with a man who had already deciphered her entire murderous blueprint. I played my role flawlessly, shuffling to the bathroom, coughing weakly, and taking my manufactured poison, which I later spat into a tissue and flushed away. But as the day progressed, a sobering reality settled over my absolute fury. I was a brilliant commercial real estate mogul, a titan of industry, who understood zoning laws, leveraged buyouts, and corporate hostile takeovers. But I was not equipped to independently dismantle a sophisticated, transnational criminal syndicate. Vivienne was a professional predator, and her network was hidden behind layers of encrypted digital walls and offshore accounts. If I made a single misstep, if I triggered a single alarm in their financial network, they would accelerate the biological collapse. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who operated comfortably within the darkest, most dangerous corners of the world. I retreated to my study under the guise of an afternoon nap. I pulled out my secure burner phone and dialed a 10-digit number I had memorized over 15 years ago. The number belonged to a man named Kessler. He was a ruthless, highly decorated former federal agent who had left the bureau to offer his extremely specialized, entirely off-the-books services to a very select group of elite corporate clients. Kessler did not have a website. He did not have an office. He existed strictly in the shadows, neutralizing corporate espionage and handling impossible, highly sensitive security threats for men who could afford his exorbitant, non-negotiable fees. I had hired him once, over a decade ago, to quietly dismantle a massive corporate extortion ring that was threatening my top executives. He had solved the problem in less than 48 hours, with chilling, absolute efficiency. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered, offering no greeting. I identified myself using the old operational code word we had established during our previous arrangement. I told him I required an immediate, face-to-face consultation regarding a massive, highly sensitive domestic threat. Kessler asked no questions. He simply gave me an address, a specific time, and hung up. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, long after my treacherous wife had fallen asleep, I slipped out the side door of my mansion. I bypassed my collection of luxury vehicles and drove a modest, unremarkable sedan that belonged to our estate manager. I navigated the quiet, rain-slicked streets of Cleveland, heading toward the derelict industrial district on the far south side of the city. The location Kessler had chosen was an abandoned, subterranean parking garage beneath a condemned municipal building. I descended the concrete ramp, the tires of the sedan splashing through shallow puddles of stagnant water. The air down here was thick, smelling of damp concrete, motor oil, and decay. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows against the cracked pillars. I parked the vehicle in the deepest, darkest corner of the third sublevel, exactly as instructed. I turned off the engine, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. The silence was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water from a fractured overhead pipe. I sat gripping the steering wheel, my heart maintaining a steady, disciplined rhythm. I was no longer a victim, waiting to be slaughtered. I was actively preparing the battlefield. 5 minutes later, a pair of blinding headlights swept across the concrete walls. A dark, heavily armored SUV descended the ramp, its engine emitting a low, powerful growl. The vehicle smoothly pulled into the empty space, directly opposite my sedan. The engine died, and the headlights snapped off. The heavy driver's side door opened with a solid, metallic clank. Kessler stepped out into the dim light. He looked exactly as I remembered him from a decade ago. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man, dressed entirely in tactical black. His face was a stoic, unreadable mask of weathered leather, his eyes cold and utterly devoid of any human empathy. He was a man who had witnessed the absolute worst of humanity and had learned to thrive in it. He walked over to my vehicle, his footsteps making absolutely no sound on the wet concrete. I rolled down my window, the chilly night air rushing into the warm cabin. Kessler nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of our shared, unspoken history. He did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply asked what kind of war I was preparing to fight. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a thick, meticulously organized manila dossier I had spent the entire afternoon compiling. I handed the heavy file through the open window. Kessler took it, his massive hands easily gripping the thick stack of papers. I looked him directly in his cold eyes and told him my own family was actively trying to murder me. I explained that they were slowly poisoning me with a synthetic neuromuscular blocking agent designed to mimic severe dementia and trigger a fatal heart attack. I told him they had completely forged my estate planning documents and transferred the bulk of my commercial real estate holdings into a shadow trust. Kessler did not flinch. He did not express an ounce of shock or pity. He simply opened the dossier, clicking on a small, tactical flashlight to examine the contents. The first section contained the complete, detailed chemical breakdown provided by the private toxicology lab. The second section contained precise physical descriptions, including the exact layout of the newly discovered corporate trust fund and the Nevada holding company Preston had utilized to siphon my wealth. But the most important section of the dossier was dedicated entirely to Vivienne. I told Kessler that she was the absolute key to the entire operation. I described her carefully cultivated persona as the sweet, educated girl from Portland, and then I detailed the faint, laser-removed gang tattoo I had spotted on her wrist. I drew the specific, rigid geometric shape from memory on a blank sheet of paper included in the file. I recounted the aggressive, highly technical financial conversation I had secretly overheard her having on a burner phone on my balcony. I told Kessler that Vivienne was not a greedy civilian. She was a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated operative connected to a major transnational syndicate, and she was the one pulling every single string. I needed her entire fabricated history torn apart. I needed to know her real name, her true criminal affiliations, and every single digital footprint she had left behind. Furthermore, I needed Kessler to meticulously trace the offshore holding company down to the very last penny. I demanded the exact routing numbers, the hidden beneficiaries, and the specific banking institutions illegally holding my stolen assets. Kessler silently closed the dossier, the tactical flashlight snapping off and plunging us back into the dim gloom of the parking garage. The ultimate hunter had officially awakened. The morning after my meeting with Kessler, I presented Marlene with an ornate, silver envelope. Inside was a fully paid reservation for a 3-day retreat at an exclusive luxury spa in Arizona. I handed it to her with a warm smile, telling her she had been working incredibly hard taking care of me and desperately needed complete relaxation. Marlene feigned polite hesitation, claiming she could not leave me alone in my fragile state. I insisted, playing the role of the devoted, guilty husband. The greedy glint flashing across her eyes betrayed her fake concern. She accepted the envelope, kissing my cheek and promising to call every evening. By Friday afternoon, my private driver escorted her to the airport, and her flight was safely in the air. The massive mansion was finally entirely mine, and the window of absolute operational freedom officially opened. Less than an hour after Marlene departed, 3 unmarked, matte black utility vans pulled into my driveway. They parked discreetly near the rear service entrance, shielded by the dense hedges. Kessler stepped out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by a team of 8. They moved with the silent, fluid precision of a highly trained military operative unit. They carried heavy tactical cases and communicated entirely through subtle hand signals. Kessler walked up the stone steps, giving me a single nod before directing his team into the house. I had given them unrestricted access to every single room and private quarter within the sprawling estate. For the next 8 hours, I watched in silent fascination as they systematically dismantled the privacy of my home. They were installing microscopic audio and video surveillance devices completely invisible to the naked eye. The technology they utilized was breathtakingly sophisticated. They embedded high-definition camera lenses into the intricate, carved woodwork of the dining room crown molding. They replaced standard electrical outlets in the master bedroom with custom faceplates housing hypersensitive, omnidirectional microphones. They placed motion-activated sensors inside the air conditioning vents, ensuring no whispered conversation would go unrecorded. They wired the solarium, the kitchen, the grand foyer, and the private dressing rooms. Every corner where Marlene or Vivian might retreat to make an incriminating phone call was compromised. Kessler personally oversaw the installation in the master suite, ensuring the area surrounding my bed was covered by overlapping feeds. If Marlene dared to check my pulse in the dead of night again, her every breath would be recorded in pristine, high-definition audio. While half of the team wired my primary residence, a secondary unit executed the exact same protocol at the downtown penthouse. Preston believed his high-rise fortress was impenetrable, guarded by a 24-hour concierge and private elevator. But Kessler effortlessly bypassed their superficial security measures. He explained his team had intercepted the scheduled maintenance call. They swapped the legitimate technicians for his own undercover operatives. The lavish living room, the private home office, and the personal vanity space were laced with the microscopic surveillance network. Kessler assured me that by midnight, I would have complete, unrestricted access to the private life of my son. We would monitor their financial laundering operations in real time, capturing their passwords and offshore routing numbers without them suspecting a thing. With the surveillance devices flawlessly integrated into the architecture of the two properties, we needed a highly secure, centralized location to store the massive digital data. I led Kessler down to the deepest sublevel of the mansion, into my private wine cellar. The cellar was built into the solid bedrock foundation, surrounded by thick concrete walls that naturally blocked any external wireless signals. It was the perfect, highly secure environment for a hidden digital command center. I instructed my estate manager to clear out the large oak tasting table in the room. Kessler and his team immediately went to work, bringing in insulated server racks and advanced cryptographic processing units. They ran thick bundles of shielded fiber optic cables through the existing ventilation shafts, hardwiring the surveillance network directly into the isolated servers to prevent any possibility of remote interception. They erected a massive, curved array of high-resolution monitors along the back wall, directly in front of my antique leather reading chair. Over the course of the next 3 hours, the dark, silent wine cellar was completely transformed into a state-of-the-art intelligence hub. The hum of the cooling fans from the server racks filled the cold air. One by one, the large monitors flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with a soft, blue digital glow. I sat down in the leather chair, watching as the screens populated with dozens of crystal-clear, real-time video feeds. I could see the empty master bedroom upstairs, the grand staircase, and the pristine kitchen. On the adjacent monitors, the live feeds from the downtown penthouse suddenly materialized. I watched my son sitting on his expensive modern sofa, casually scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible eyes staring directly at him. Kessler stood beside me, in the dim blue light of the monitors. He handed me a heavily encrypted biometric tablet that controlled the entire network. He explained that the system was utilizing advanced, voice recognition software that would automatically flag and categorize any conversations containing specific financial or medical keywords. If Vivienne so much as whispered the name of a chemical compound or an offshore trust fund, the system would instantly alert me and secure the recording in an isolated, tamper-proof digital vault. Kessler told me that the technical infrastructure was absolutely flawless, and now we simply had to wait for them to make a mistake. He nodded once, turned around, and led his team out of the wine cellar, leaving me completely alone in the glowing darkness. I sat in the cold, absolute silence of the underground room, surrounded by thousands of bottles of vintage wine and a wall of glowing digital screens. The sheer power of the surveillance network was deeply intoxicating. I had spent the last several grueling months stumbling blindly through a chemically induced fog, utterly helpless and completely at the mercy of the predators who had infiltrated my home. But that pathetic, vulnerable man was entirely gone. I was now the unseen, invisible architect of their impending destruction. I watched Preston slowly pour himself a glass of expensive scotch on monitor 4, while Vivienne walked into the frame, speaking animatedly into her black phone. I slowly leaned back in my leather chair and took a deep, steadying breath. I did not need to guess their intentions anymore. I did not need to rely on sudden, brief moments of eavesdropping. I had captured their entire world within a completely flawless, heavily secured digital cage. They thought they were the master manipulators, controlling the fate of a dying empire. They had absolutely no idea that every single word they spoke, Every single malicious lie they constructed, and every single breath they took, was now fully belonging to me. The hunter had finally taken his rightful position, in the absolute, quiet dark, and I was perfectly content to sit quietly in the shadows and watch them dig their own inescapable graves. The following morning, I drove to a discreet, unmarked building located in the heart of the financial district. I bypassed the crowded main lobby and took a private elevator directly to the top floor. Waiting for me in a sterile, windowless conference room was Barrett. He was my most trusted corporate attorney, a man whose absolute ruthlessness in the courtroom was matched only by his fiercely unwavering loyalty to me. Barrett was a vicious shark in a tailored suit, a brilliant legal predator who thrived on tearing apart hostile takeovers and crushing arrogant competitors. I had paid him a fortune over the decades to protect my empire, and he had never lost a single battle. I placed Kessler's heavily encrypted digital tablet onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The screen glowed brightly with the massive cache of surveillance data and offshore financial records we had meticulously intercepted overnight. Barrett silently poured us both a cup of black coffee, sat down, and adjusted his reading glasses. I told him to look very closely at the architecture of the trust fund Preston had recently established, but more importantly, I critically needed him to analyze the dangerous woman Preston fully intended to marry. I watched carefully as Barrett's eyes darted across the glowing screen, his stoic expression rapidly shifting from casual professional curiosity to absolute, unadulterated shock. The preliminary findings Kessler had painstakingly compiled were nothing short of staggering. He had completely dismantled Vivienne's carefully constructed background in less than 12 hours. The sweet, highly educated girl from Portland simply did not exist. Her social security number actually belonged to a deceased infant who tragically died in the late 80s. Her impressive college degrees were immaculate digital forgeries, inserted directly into the university servers just 2 short years ago. Kessler's advanced facial recognition software had accurately matched her to a highly secure international criminal database. Vivienne was a highly skilled, deeply embedded operative working for a brutal overseas syndicate, infamous for laundering billions of dollars in illicit drug and dangerous weapons profits. She was a ghost, a lethal financial phantom who moved fluidly from city to city, quietly infiltrating wealthy, vulnerable families and systematically draining their extensive assets before vanishing completely into thin air. Barrett slowly leaned back in his leather chair, running a heavy hand over his face in utter disbelief. He stated categorically that the extreme level of sophistication required to fabricate an identity this flawlessly was far beyond the capability of any standard criminal. Vivienne was powerfully backed by a massive, highly organized global network equipped with completely limitless resources. They had deliberately targeted my commercial real estate empire because my corporate accounts were perfectly clean, historically profitable, and practically immune to standard federal auditing triggers. Barrett quickly brought up the specific legal framework of the shadow trust Preston had blindly signed. We ruthlessly dissected the complex legal jargon together, completely unraveling the true, devastating nature of their brilliant financial trap. The trust was not merely designed to selfishly steal my accumulated wealth. It was a fully functional washing machine, specifically built for $50 million of exceptionally dirty syndicate money. Vivienne deliberately planned to trigger my sudden medical incapacitation, legally seize total control of the corporate holding accounts, and immediately funnel the syndicate's illicit cash directly through my pristine commercial real estate portfolios. The dirty money would rapidly bounce through a dozen anonymous shell companies, acquiring the incredibly false appearance of highly legitimate real estate investments, before ultimately landing safely in secure offshore accounts, controlled entirely by her overseas bosses. Preston was a pathetically arrogant fool who honestly believed he was brilliantly securing his vast inheritance, completely unaware that he was eagerly signing his name to a massive federal crime. If their insidious plan actually succeeded, the federal government would inevitably trace the heavily laundered funds directly back to my completely legitimate companies. The merciless authorities would immediately seize my entire empire, permanently freeze all my legitimate assets, and Preston would spend the rest of his miserable life rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Vivian would be long gone, happily leaving my utterly destroyed family to take the absolute ruinous fall. A cold, incredibly heavy silence quickly filled the windowless conference room as the sheer magnitude of their totally malicious operation became undeniably clear. Barrett looked directly at me, a highly dangerous, predatory smile slowly spreading across his hardened face. He calmly asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed. I told him we were going to eagerly let them attempt their massive financial transfer, but we were going to expertly ensure they transferred absolutely nothing but their own total destruction. Over the course of the next 6 grueling hours, Barrett and I brilliantly executed a highly aggressive, meticulously planned financial maneuver. We systematically drained every single drop of actual liquid capital from my vast corporate holding accounts. We seamlessly moved the entire $50 million into a deeply secure, completely untraceable federal holding account, utilizing a highly classified legal mechanism Barrett strictly reserved for extreme corporate emergencies. We effectively emptied the entire vault. But to actively prevent Vivian and Preston from suddenly noticing the missing funds, Barrett masterfully fabricated a flawless digital mirage. He expertly manipulated the front-end banking interfaces, completely ensuring the displayed account balances still reflected the full $50 million. To anyone looking at the computer screens in my office or on a mobile banking application, the money appeared perfectly intact and ready for immediate transfer. But a simple visual illusion was entirely not enough to completely spring the ultimate trap. I absolutely needed to strictly ensure that the exact moment Vivian attempted to execute her master plan, she would instantly trigger her own inescapable doom. Barrett quickly opened the hidden digital architecture of the specific trust documents Preston had illegally placed on the main company servers. Working efficiently with a tiny team of elite, deeply trusted cybersecurity experts, Barrett expertly embedded a highly lethal, extraordinarily sophisticated poison pill code directly into the foundational transfer mechanism. This deeply malicious script was carefully designed to remain completely dormant until the exact second Vivian initiated the $50 million transfer. Once triggered, the hidden poison pill would instantaneously execute 3 catastrophic commands. First, it would completely lock down the entire network, permanently freezing every single computer terminal and preventing any possible cancellation of the transfer. Second, it would instantly capture and permanently record all the hidden offshore routing numbers and illicit syndicate banking destinations Vivian had programmed into the trust. Finally, The lethal poison pill would automatically transmit a massive, heavily encrypted data packet containing all the intercepted routing numbers, the audio confessions Kessler had captured, and the undeniable proof of the attempted money laundering directly to the chief director of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We sat back and watched the brilliant cybersecurity technicians flawlessly finalize the highly lethal code integration. The blue progress bar on the massive screen hit 100%. A small, flashing green light confidently confirmed the poison pill was successfully embedded and fully armed. Barrett quietly closed his laptop. The magnificent trap was completely set. The final pieces of my intricate vengeance were falling perfectly into place. I left Barrett in the sterile conference room and took the private elevator down to the bustling city streets. The cold afternoon wind bit at my face, but I felt nothing but the warm, steady burn of absolute purpose. I directed my driver to take me back to the Shaker Heights mansion, knowing that tonight would require the most critical and demanding performance of my entire life. I needed to convince 3 incredibly greedy, highly observant predators that their poisonous campaign had finally broken me. I needed them to believe that the mighty titan of commercial real estate was now nothing more than a terrified, deteriorating old man desperately clinging to his last shreds of dignity. When I arrived home, the evening shadows had already stretched across the manicured lawns. Marlene had returned from her luxurious spa weekend, her skin glowing and her demeanor casually dismissive. Preston and Vivian had also arrived for our customary Sunday family dinner, a ritual I had insisted we maintain to project an image of familial unity. I slowly walked through the grand foyer, intentionally dragging my left foot and allowing my shoulders to slump under an invisible, crushing weight. I greeted the housekeeper with a confused, vacant stare, asking her what day of the week it was. I could see Marlene watching me from the parlor, her eyes narrowing with calculated assessment as I shuffled past her. We gathered in the formal dining room just as the antique grandfather clock struck 7. The long mahogany table was set with pristine white linen, heavy crystal glasses, and polished silver. I took my place at the head of the table, letting my hands tremble slightly as I reached for my water glass. I made sure to clink the crystal violently against my teeth, spilling a few cold drops down my chin and onto my expensive tailored shirt. Marlene sat to my immediate right, playing the role of the concerned wife by quickly offering me a cloth napkin. I took it with a shaky, pathetic murmur of thanks, refusing to meet her gaze. Preston and Vivian sat directly across from us. Vivian looked picture-perfect in a simple silk blouse, projecting pure, unadulterated sweetness. But I now knew the absolute truth about the brutal criminal operative hiding beneath that flawless skin. Throughout the first course, I remained completely silent. I pushed my roasted vegetables around the expensive porcelain plate with a heavy silver fork, staring blankly at the floral centerpiece. Preston attempted to engage me in a superficial conversation about the latest stock market trends, an obvious test of my cognitive function. I responded with a fragmented, nonsensical sentence about a commercial zoning deal I had closed 3 decades ago. The room fell into a heavy, dramatic silence. I could feel the electric current of anticipation humming violently between the 3 of them. I slowly lowered my silver fork and let out a long, ragged sigh that seemed to rattle around inside my frail chest. I looked up, letting my eyes glaze over with a perfectly manufactured expression of profound, inescapable terror. I looked at Marlene, then at Preston, and finally at Vivienne. I forced a thick, emotional lump into my throat and allowed the very first tear to spill over my lower eyelid. I told them that I could no longer hide from the terrible truth. My voice cracked, wavering with the pathetic vulnerability of a truly defeated man. I confessed that my mind was slipping away from me, vanishing into a dark, terrifying fog that I simply could not fight anymore. I described the terrifying moments of blank confusion, the vast gaps in my memory, and the overwhelming fear of waking up and not knowing my own name. I told them that the great intellect I had relied upon for my entire life was failing, abandoning me to a lonely, terrifying darkness. I wept openly, letting the tears stream down my wrinkled cheeks, performing the absolute destruction of my own towering pride. I reached out and weakly grasped Marlene's hand, feeling the cold, rigid stiffness of her fingers as she forced herself to comfort me. I told her I was so incredibly sorry for becoming such a massive burden to her. Then, I turned my tear-stained face toward my son. I told Preston that I had spent my entire life building an empire from absolutely nothing, sacrificing my youth and my energy to ensure my family would never experience the bitter sting of poverty. But I knew that my time at the helm was rapidly coming to a tragic end. I told him that I could not bear the thought of my legacy crumbling into ruin because I was too stubborn to step down. I took a deep, shuddering breath and delivered the ultimate bait. I announced that I was finally ready to surrender. I told them that I had contacted my corporate attorneys earlier that afternoon to finalize the ultimate transition of power. I stated that this coming Friday night, I would formally sign the comprehensive estate transfer documents. I would legally relinquish my total executive authority, willingly surrender the commercial holdings, and formally place my entire liquid fortune into the new trust fund Preston had prepared. I told them I wanted to finalize the transition while I still possessed enough mental clarity to recognize my own signature. I wanted to hand them the absolute keys to the kingdom before I lost my sanity completely. Friday night would be the definitive end of my reign and the glorious beginning of theirs. The reaction was immediate, powerful, and utterly sickening to witness. They desperately tried to mask it beneath thick layers of manufactured sympathy and gentle reassurances, but they could not hide the raw, predatory triumph blazing brightly in their eyes. Marlene squeezed my hand, offering me a soft, patronizing smile, while murmuring that it was the right decision for everyone. But I saw the tight tension instantly drain from her shoulders, replaced by a radiant, deeply sinister satisfaction. She thought she had finally won her ultimate freedom and her massive fortune. Preston sat up straighter in his chair, puffing out his chest with sheer, unearned arrogance. He solemnly promised me that he would protect the company and honor my legacy. He looked at me, not with a devoted son's love, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a scavenger standing over a fresh carcass. But it was Vivienne who provided the most chilling reaction of all. She maintained her sweet, innocent expression, reaching across the table to gently touch Preston's arm in a show of supportive solidarity. Yet, in the microscopic tightening of her jaw and the dark, predatory gleam flashing deep within her eyes, I saw the true face of the international syndicate operative. She thought she had successfully manipulated a billionaire into willingly handing over $50 million of perfectly clean commercial assets. She thought her brilliant laundering operation was mere days away from total, glorious execution. They were absolutely convinced that they had outsmarted me, that my legendary intellect had finally surrendered to the ravages of time. They were blindly walking straight into the most devastating ambush I had designed. By Thursday evening, the tension within the mansion had reached an almost unbearable peak. I maintained my facade of a broken old man, shuffling aimlessly through the hallways. Marlene left the estate shortly after dinner, claiming she needed to meet a friend. I knew exactly where she was going. As her vehicle cleared the security gates, I descended into the isolation of my subterranean wine cellar. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the cold bunker. I sat in my leather reading chair and activated the encrypted tablet. The array of high-resolution monitors flickered to life, illuminating the dark concrete walls with a blue digital glow. I bypassed my own cameras and pulled up the live feeds from Preston's downtown penthouse. The primary camera, embedded within the living room crown molding, provided a sweeping view of the space. The windows showcased the Cleveland skyline, but my focus was on the three figures gathered around the marble kitchen island. Marlene, Preston, and Vivian were standing together, bathed in the warm light of the penthouse. A bottle of vintage champagne rested on the counter, surrounded by three half-empty crystal flutes. They were celebrating their impending victory. The omnidirectional microphones captured every single syllable of their conversation, with terrifying clarity. Marlene was holding her glass, her face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and pure greed. She was laughing, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed through the hidden speakers in my basement. She openly mocked my tearful performance from the previous night, mimicking my trembling hands and broken voice. She called it the most pathetic display of weakness she had ever witnessed, complaining about how difficult it was to keep a straight face. Preston leaned against the counter, swirling the champagne in his flute with an arrogant smirk. He proudly declared that the commercial real estate empire was finally out of the hands of a dinosaur. He boasted about his negotiation tactics, claiming total credit for backing me into a psychological corner. He spoke of the legacy as if it were a new toy, oblivious to the decades of sacrifice required to build it. He outlined plans to fire the senior partners who remained loyal to me, intending to replace them with his own friends. He was blind to the fact that his supposed brilliance was nothing more than an orchestrated manipulation. He honestly believed he was the undisputed king of the corporate boardroom. Vivian stood slightly apart from them, nursing her champagne with a clinical detachment. She smiled and nodded at Preston's declarations, but her eyes were cold, sweeping over her accomplices with the calculating gaze of an apex predator. For a while, the atmosphere in the penthouse was a sickening display of predatory triumph. They believed tomorrow night was a mere formality that would unlock their wildest desires. But as the champagne bottle was emptied, the fragile alliance between the conspirators began to fracture. The celebratory mood evaporated, replaced by the brutal reality of dividing the stolen spoils. Marlene was the first to draw a weapon in this verbal war. She slammed her crystal flute onto the counter, the sharp crack silencing Preston's arrogant monologue. Her voice dropped into a harsh, demanding register. She looked at her son and demanded that her share of the liquidated assets be transferred into her accounts by Monday morning. She stated that she had endured years of a suffocating marriage, and she refused to wait a single day longer for her payout. She wanted her money, and she wanted complete separation from the family name. The sheer entitlement in her voice was staggering. She spoke as if she had earned every single penny through hard labor, ignoring the fact that she was actively conspiring to murder her husband to acquire it. Preston bristled immediately, his arrogant smile vanishing into a defensive scowl. He pushed himself off the counter, stepping aggressively toward his mother. He told Marlene that she was out of her mind if she thought he was going to execute a multi-million-dollar transfer the first business day after his father surrendered control. He argued that moving that much liquid capital so rapidly would trigger a catastrophic series of federal audits. He demanded that she remain patient, explaining that the money needed to quietly settle within the newly established trust fund. He insisted that he needed to establish his authority over the corporate board first. He told her she would get her money when he decided it was safe, and not a second sooner. The argument escalated with blinding speed. Marlene's face flushed with violent rage. She stepped closer to Preston, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She accused him of attempting to cut her out of the deal entirely. She aggressively reminded him that without her constant administration of the synthetic poison, my mind would never have deteriorated. She claimed absolute ownership over the physical degradation, pointing a manicured finger at his chest and threatening to expose his fraudulent real estate transfers. Preston shouted back, his face contorted in a furious sneer. He called her a pathetic gold digger, loudly reminding her that without his executive access to the company servers, she would never have seen a single dime. They were standing inches apart, screaming venomous insults at each other, their greedy alliance crumbling into absolute, chaotic hatred. I sat in the cold silence of the subterranean wine cellar, watching the spectacular implosion of my family with unblinking fascination. As Marlene and Preston screamed at each other over the island, Vivian calmly set her crystal flute down. The sweet, innocent facade she maintained for years vanished entirely, melting away to reveal the cold, ruthless, international operative lurking beneath. She did not raise her voice. She spoke one single, commanding sentence that instantly sliced through the chaotic screaming. She told them to shut their pathetic mouths. The sheer, icy authority in her voice was so completely unnatural, entirely foreign to the demure persona they knew, that Marlene and Preston instantly froze. They turned to look at her, their faces registering a sudden, profound confusion. Vivienne stepped forward, her posture rigid, and her eyes burning with pure, sociopathic dominance. She looked at Preston as if he were a completely worthless insect. She systematically dismantled his entire ego in a matter of seconds, explaining that he was never in control of the operation. She explicitly revealed that the $50 million trust fund he had blindly established was not a secure vault for his inheritance. It was a heavily insulated laundering mechanism designed to wash syndicate money through his father's pristine corporate accounts. She told a stunned, completely paralyzed Preston that he would not be dividing any assets on Monday morning, because the very second his father signed the transfer documents on Friday night, the entire $50 million would instantly route to offshore accounts, completely beyond his reach. Marlene gasped, stepping back from the kitchen island as the horrifying reality of their situation finally began to dawn on her. She demanded to know who Vivian really was and what she had done with their promised fortune. Vivian offered a slow, terrifying smile that did not reach her dead eyes. She explicitly informed Marlene that if she ever raised her voice or threatened to expose the operation again, she would be quietly and efficiently, permanently neutralized. Vivian explained that she worked for people who did not tolerate greed, incompetence, or threats. She dictated the new, absolute reality to her two paralyzed victims. They would smile, they would play their roles tomorrow night, and they would gratefully accept whatever microscopic fraction of the money her employers decided to leave behind. I watched from the dark, perfectly still, as the ultimate predators realized they had been the prey all along. The heavy, suffocating silence in the penthouse, following Vivian's chilling ultimatum, hung in the air like toxic smoke. Vivian turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor, and retreated toward the guest bedroom, leaving Marlene and Preston standing frozen in the center of the kitchen. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, the fragile remnants of their maintained composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Panic, raw and entirely unfiltered, began to rapidly radiate from my treacherous wife, and the pathetic man I had foolishly believed for over 3 decades to be my only beloved son. Marlene began to pace the length of the marble island, her hands trembling violently as the terrifying reality of their precarious situation finally took hold. If Vivian controlled the trust mechanism, they were going to be left with absolutely nothing but worthless financial scraps. Marlene stopped abruptly, her eyes locking onto Preston with a terrifying, desperate intensity. She lowered her voice to a vicious, frantic whisper, insisting that their entire master plan had been compromised by an outsider. She stated that they simply could not afford to wait for the scheduled meeting on Friday night. She argued that if I legally signed those transfer documents, the $50 million fortune would instantly vanish into the overseas syndicate's offshore accounts, leaving them vulnerable and entirely destitute. She stepped closer to him, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She demanded that they abandon the constructed legal transfer protocol immediately. She instructed Preston to massively increase the daily dosage of the synthetic neuromuscular blocking agent without any further delay. She explicitly stated that she wanted the biological collapse to happen tonight while I slept. She coldly reasoned that if I died unexpectedly before signing the finalized papers, my original will would automatically dictate the division of the estate, temporarily tying the assets up in lengthy probate proceedings, but legally keeping the immense fortune safely out of Vivian's lethal, thieving grasp. Preston recoiled from her, as if she had caught fire. His face drained of all remaining color, replaced by a sickening, translucent shade of pale gray. He frantically shook his head back and forth, his trembling hands raised defensively in front of his chest, as if to physically block her terrifying words. He stammered incoherently, his voice cracking painfully under the crushing, suffocating weight of sheer terror. He told Marlene that she had absolutely lost her mind to even suggest such a profoundly dangerous course of action. He forcefully argued that a sudden, unexplainable death just 48 hours before a massive, highly publicized corporate handover would immediately raise massive red flags across the entire medical community. He frantically explained that the local authorities would undoubtedly order a full, comprehensive, and highly intrusive medical autopsy. The synthetic poison, while brilliantly designed to slowly mimic severe dementia over a prolonged period of time, would be glaringly obvious to any competent toxicologist if administered in a massive, lethal overdose. The medical examiner would easily find the toxic chemical markers flooding my bloodstream, and the resulting homicide investigation would inevitably lead the homicide detectives directly to their front doorstep. Preston practically begged her to listen to basic reason, frantically insisting that going to a federal prison for premeditated murder was infinitely worse than losing the $50 million trust fund to Vivian. Marlene simply stared at him, her chest heaving with furious, ragged breaths as she processed his pathetic display of cowardice. The absolute, unvarnished contempt burning in her eyes was truly terrifying to behold. She did not see a loyal partner, and she certainly did not see a beloved son standing before her. She only saw a pathetic, cowardly obstacle standing directly between her and the immense wealth she felt entirely entitled to claim. Without a single word of warning, she raised her right hand and struck Preston across the face with devastating, unrestrained force. The sharp, violent crack of her palm against his cheek echoed loudly through the spacious penthouse kitchen, registering with crystal clarity through the hidden microphones in my underground surveillance command center. Preston stumbled backward into the stainless steel refrigerator, clutching his rapidly reddening face in absolute shock, far too stunned to even utter a sound of protest. Marlene aggressively stepped into his personal space, pointing a rigid, perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. Her voice dropped into a lethal, venomous hiss that literally chilled the blood flowing through my veins. She told him to immediately stop acting like a pathetic, weak coward. She screamed that she had not sacrificed 35 years of her life, playing the devoted, caring wife to a man she entirely despised, just to lose absolutely everything, because her supposed son was too terrified to properly finish the job. And then, with a twisted, utterly sadistic sneer, she delivered the final, life-altering, crushing blow. She told Preston that he had absolutely no legal or moral right to inherit a single dime of the corporate empire. She leaned in even closer, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice, and explicitly stated that he was not my biological son. She confessed, with terrifying, arrogant pride, that she had deliberately and maliciously trapped me over 3 decades ago. She had entirely fabricated the circumstances of her pregnancy, utilizing a brief, meaningless affair with a worthless, small-time grifter she had met in a cheap, filthy downtown motel. She had expertly manipulated my fundamental sense of honor and deeply ingrained morality, forcing me into a lifelong marriage built entirely upon a colossal, unforgivable lie. She stared directly into his horrified, tear-filled eyes and cruelly informed him that he did not possess a single drop of my blood, my soaring intellect, or my relentless drive. He was merely a convenient, biological prop she had expertly utilized to permanently secure her unassailable position within my immense, growing fortune. She vehemently vowed that she would not allow the weak, pathetic son of a nameless con artist to ruin the massive financial operation she had spent her entire adult life meticulously orchestrating. Down in the absolute silent darkness of the subterranean wine cellar, I sat completely immobilized in my heavy leather reading chair. My beating heart turned to absolute solid ice within my chest. The steady, rhythmic hum of the digital server racks faded into a dull, distant roar as the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of her deception permanently shattered my entire reality. 34 years. I had spent 34 grueling years building a magnificent commercial empire, specifically to secure the prosperous future of a child who was not even mine. Every personal sacrifice, every sleepless late night in the corporate boardroom, every single ounce of paternal pride I had ever felt was entirely based on a meticulously crafted, sociopathic illusion. I stared blankly at the glowing monitor, silently watching the vicious woman I had married, and the terrified stranger I had called my son. I was no longer a betrayed father, or a tragically deceived husband mourning a lost family. I was a broken man who had absolutely nothing left in this world to lose, and my impending vengeance against these parasites would be total. The digital monitors painted the cold concrete walls of my wine cellar in a pale, ghostly light. I sat frozen in my heavy leather chair, the absolute magnitude of my wife's confession echoing through the subterranean silence. 34 years of marriage, an entire lifetime of building an empire, only to discover I had been meticulously bled dry by a common grifter and the nameless bastard she had dragged into my home. On the screen, the silence in the penthouse was equally suffocating. Preston was slumped against the stainless steel refrigerator, his face a portrait of complete, utter devastation. The arrogant prince had just been brutally stripped of his crown, reduced to a pathetic, shivering fraud. Marlene stood over him, her chest heaving with venomous pride, completely unapologetic for the decades of deceit she had just casually unraveled. The emotional destruction of my fake family was abruptly cut short. Vivian stepped out of the hallway shadows, moving with the terrifying, fluid grace of a hunting viper. She looked at Preston without an ounce of sympathy, and at Marlene without any respect. She clapped her hands together, a sharp, commanding sound that instantly severed the thick tension in the room. Her voice was a cold, clinical blade, completely devoid of the melodic sweetness I had endured for the past year. She announced that the time for pathetic domestic melodrama was over, and the time for executing the final operational protocol had officially arrived. Vivian walked slowly toward the marble kitchen island, her eyes locked onto the two trembling frauds before her. She calmly explained the precise nature of her presence in their miserable lives. She told Preston that she had never loved him, that she had never even found him remotely tolerable. She stated that their entire relationship, the lavish engagement, the meticulously planned future, was nothing more than a highly lucrative $2 million contract. She revealed that her employers required a completely spotless domestic front to infiltrate my corporate accounts. They needed an impeccably clean, seemingly innocent identity to bridge the gap between their overseas syndicate and my heavily protected commercial empire. Preston was merely the easiest, most gullible target her organization could identify. He was a vain, insecure man, desperate for validation, making him the perfect vehicle for a massive international money laundering operation. She told him that the engagement ring on her finger was a prop, purchased with the syndicate's operational budget, and that she was a professional ghost, hired specifically to drain the blood from an aging titan while his foolish family clapped and cheered. Marlene attempted to interrupt, sputtering a frantic question about the $50 million. Vivian silenced her with a single, deeply terrifying look. She informed my treacherous wife the money was no longer a matter for negotiation. The syndicate was taking the vast majority. And if Marlene and Preston wanted to survive the week, they would do exactly as they were told. The original plan had been to slowly degrade my mind, to force a medical declaration of incompetence, and to cleanly transfer the funds by Friday night. But Marlene's paranoid outburst and Preston's complete loss of nerve had drastically altered the timeline. Vivienne leaned over the marble counter, her dark eyes flashing with a ruthless, calculating intelligence. She declared that waiting for Friday was no longer a viable operational strategy. The internal conflict had made them sloppy, and she refused to risk her employer's capital on the fragile nerves of two bickering amateurs. She announced that the biological collapse had to occur tonight. Preston immediately began to protest, stammering again about the severe risks of an autopsy and the undeniable chemical markers of the synthetic poison they had been using. Vivienne silenced him by reaching into a sleek, black leather briefcase retrieved from the guest room. She pulled out a small, pressurized metallic canister and a highly specialized, medical-grade syringe. She set the items on the counter with a metallic clink. She explained, with chilling, scientific precision, they were not going to use the neuromuscular blocking agent. She had brought a secondary, infinitely more sophisticated mechanism. The canister contained a heavily concentrated, completely untraceable synthetic gas designed to induce a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. It was a flawless, invisible weapon. She detailed the exact method of execution. They would drive to the mansion under the cover of darkness. They would utilize the master keys to bypass the security systems and slip silently into the master bedroom. Once inside, they would inject the concentrated gas directly into the reservoir tube of my nocturnal breathing machine. She meticulously outlined the biological reaction. As I slept, the breathing machine would pump the lethal, undetectable gas directly into my lungs. My heart would violently seize within minutes, mimicking a massive, entirely natural cardiac arrest. By the time the paramedics arrived in the morning, the chemical compound would have completely evaporated from my bloodstream, leaving absolutely no trace for the medical examiner. It would be officially ruled a sudden failure of an aging heart, a natural death, accelerated by my recently diagnosed cognitive decline. The estate would instantly enter probate, but the holding trusts Vivienne had established would remain completely insulated and primed for extraction. Marlene and Preston stared at the metallic canister on the marble counter, their faces reflecting a twisted mixture of sheer terror and desperate, greedy salvation. They slowly nodded their heads in silent agreement, willingly sealing a pact to murder me in cold blood. I watched from the dark isolation of my command center as Vivienne expertly packed the syringe and the lethal canister back into her black leather briefcase. She issued a final, sharp command, ordering them to gather their coats. The three of them moved toward the penthouse elevator, their faces set with dark, murderous determination. The live camera feeds tracked their progress as they descended to the private parking garage, climbed into Marlene's luxury vehicle, and pulled out onto the rain-slicked city streets. They were driving straight toward my home, carrying the exact instrument of my intended death. I reached out and tapped the encrypted tablet. One by one, the high-resolution monitors flickered, the bright screens fading back into the deep, absolute blackness of the subterranean wine cellar. The only sound left in the room was the quiet, steady hum of the heavy server racks processing the flawless, high-definition evidence of their massive criminal conspiracy. I stood up slowly from my leather reading chair, feeling no fear, no panic, and no lingering sorrow. I walked to the antique wooden cabinet against the far concrete wall. I retrieved a crystal tumbler and a bottle of my oldest single malt whiskey. I poured a generous measure of the amber liquid, the soft splashing sound echoing perfectly in the quiet dark. I raised the heavy crystal glass, taking a slow, deep sip, feeling the warm, familiar burn trace down my throat. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face in the shadows. The bait had been completely swallowed. The trap was entirely armed. The hunters were finally coming to my house, blissfully unaware that the gates of absolute hell were about to swing wide open to welcome them. The antique grandfather clock in the downstairs foyer silently ticked past 2 o'clock on Friday morning. In the absolute, suffocating darkness of my master bedroom, the only sound was the artificial whirring of my keypap machine, which I had purposefully left running on the empty mattress. I stood in the deep shadows of the far corner, my eyes adjusted to the gloom, waiting with freezing patience. Then, the heavy brass door handle slowly began to turn. A faint, agonizing creak echoed through the space as the bedroom door parted from its frame. 3 distinct shadows crept fluidly across the threshold, moving with the practiced, predatory stealth of thieves in the night. I watched through the darkness as Marlene led the way, her silhouette rigid with a desperate, frantic energy. Close behind her was Preston, his posture stiff with a lingering, terrified hesitation. Bringing up the rear was Vivienne, holding the black leather briefcase tightly against her side. They converged on the edge of the bed like vultures, circling a fresh carcass. In the dim light filtering through the drapes, I saw the metallic glint of the massive medical syringe and the pressurized canister of lethal, untraceable gas. Marlene reached out, her hand steady with pure malice, prepared to inject the poison directly into the breathing tube and end my life forever. Suddenly, a brilliant, blinding wall of white floodlights exploded from the ceiling, instantly illuminating every corner of the vast master bedroom. The sudden glare was deafening in its visual intensity. Marlene let out a sharp, ragged scream of terror, dropping the silver syringe onto the hardwood floor as she protected her blinded eyes. Preston stumbled backward, in absolute panic, his boots slipping on the polished wood as he violently crashed against the bedside table. Vivienne instantly froze, her clinical detachment shattering into a mask of pure survivalist shock as her eyes adjusted to the blinding light. They did not find a helpless, deteriorating old man dying in his bed. The mattress was completely empty. Instead, they found themselves staring directly at me. I was sitting perfectly upright in a heavy leather armchair in the center of the room, dressed in a flawless, tailored suit, calmly sipping a glass of single malt whiskey. Flanking my chair were Detective Kessler and my merciless corporate attorney, Barrett, and stepping fluidly out of the adjoining dressing room were 6 heavily armed federal agents, their tactical submachine guns raised and locked directly onto the chests of the 3 completely paralyzed conspirators. The cold, heavy silence that filled the illuminated bedroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of Preston's frantic, shallow breathing. I set my crystal glass down on the side table with a slow, deliberate click. I looked directly at the shivering man I had proudly raised for 34 years. letting my gaze strip away every remaining shred of his unearned arrogance. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a certified, heavily stamped medical document. I dropped the official DNA test results onto the floor, watching it flutter lazily before landing directly at his boots. I told him, my voice completely flat and devoid of any paternal warmth, that his entire life had been a colossal, pathetic lie. I revealed that I had watched the penthouse surveillance feed, heard every single syllable of his mother's venomous confession, and possessed the absolute proof that he was merely the bastard child of a worthless grifter. The crushing weight of the truth hit him like a physical blow. His knees visibly buckled, and a pathetic, choking sob escaped his throat as his entire reality permanently collapsed. I turned my icy gaze away from the broken fraud and locked it onto Vivian. The sweet, innocent girl from Portland was completely gone, replaced by a desperate criminal operative cornered in a trap from which there was no escape. I picked up a thick, red folder from the table beside me and threw it across the room. The papers scattered across the floor, unraveling her pristine digital identity to reveal her secure international criminal dossier. I told her that her multi-million-dollar contract with the overseas syndicate was officially terminated. I revealed that Kessler had unmasked her fabricated credentials, traced her actual fingerprints to a secured laundering network, and mapped out the exact architecture of her global syndicate. Her eyes darted frantically toward the window, her mind desperately searching for an escape route, but the solid wall of federal weapons pinned her completely in place. Preston, desperately baring his teeth in a final grasp at victory, let out a manic, unhinged laugh. He aggressively pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking with a sharp, hysterical malice. He shouted that it was too late for a dramatic trap, because at midnight, Vivienne had officially executed the legal trust documents on the company servers. He bragged that the $50 million of actual liquid capital had already been cleanly transferred out of my corporate holding accounts. He screamed that they were rich, that the money was permanently theirs, and that no federal weapon could force them to give it back. I watched his desperate display with pure, freezing contempt. I turned to Barrett, who slowly opened his laptop, displaying a flashing green interface to the panicked conspirators. I delivered the ultimate, fatal masterstroke. I revealed to the horrified trio that the $50 million they saw on their banking interfaces was nothing more than a flawless digital mirage. I explained the true nature of the hidden poison pill code Barrett had masterfully embedded within the foundational transfer mechanism. The exact millisecond Vivienne initiated the wire transfer, the highly sophisticated automated script automatically executed 3 catastrophic commands. It permanently locked down their network, intercepted the hidden offshore routing numbers of their overseas bosses, and irreversibly donated every single drop of the $50 million directly to a federal anti-fraud fund. I told them they had transferred absolutely nothing but their own total destruction. They had left a pristine, immutable digital trail of international wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted murder that directly connected their global syndicate to a massive federal investigation. The vault was completely empty, and they were utterly bankrupt. The realization of their inescapable ruin washed over them with devastating force. Marlene collapsed to her knees, tearing at her hair as she begged for mercy, her lifelong con ending in absolute failure. Preston sank down beside her, weeping hysterically, like a broken child, as the cold steel of federal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Vivian offered no resistance. She silently closed her eyes, as an agent pinned her arms behind her back, her career permanently extinguished. The agents forcefully dragged the 3 weeping parasites out of my master bedroom and down the staircase. I walked slowly to the bay windows, watching as they were shoved into the waiting police cruisers. The flashing blue strobe lights cast a magnificent, triumphant glow across the darkened estate. I watched with deep satisfaction as the sirens began to wail, the cruisers accelerating away, carrying the monsters out of my life forever. I turned back into the quiet majesty of my home, finally enveloped in a profound, absolute peace. The dust has finally settled. It has been exactly 1 year since the dramatic arrests on my front lawn. Preston, Marlene, and Vivian are currently serving severe federal sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years in maximum security penitentiaries. Their global syndicate was entirely dismantled using the immutable digital evidence my trap captured. As for me, I am standing on the expansive balcony of my newly acquired downtown penthouse, looking out over the glittering Cleveland skyline. I did not simply survive their vicious conspiracy, I conquered it. I aggressively liquidated the toxic assets connected to their scheme and completely restructured my entire corporate portfolio. I am finally completely free from the insidious parasites that fed eagerly on my blood, sweat, and tireless labor for decades. The vast silence in my home is no longer a heavy, lonely burden. It is the magnificent, ringing sound of absolute freedom. I walk back inside and pour a generous measure of the very same 50-year-old single malt scotch, perfectly clean and untainted. I raise the heavy crystal glass to the illuminated city and drink deeply to my second, triumphant life. The empire remains mine, but the treacherous court has been permanently banished. I rebuilt my foundation entirely on truth, surrounding myself only with professionals who proved their unwavering loyalty when the shadows grew longest. My legacy is secure, protected by the ultimate vigilance. I am alive, thriving, and perfectly in control of my own magnificent destiny, today, tomorrow, and forevermore. The greatest illusion we hold is that blood guarantees loyalty, and that wealth buys true love. I spent my entire life building a massive kingdom, only to realize I was blindly funding my own executioners. Trust is a beautiful concept, but blind trust is an absolute death sentence. When your intuition whispers that something is profoundly wrong, you must listen to it. Do not let sentimental emotions blind you to the cold, hard facts. True strength is not just about building an empire. It is about having the ruthlessness to burn it to the ground and rebuild it when needed. If my story resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you completely trusted? Share your personal experience in the comments below. Let us build a strong community of survivors. See you all next time.